David Seymour.
An issue that I hear about frequently in the Epsom electorate in Auckland and up and down New Zealand, oddly enough, is not the Saudi sheep deal. Really? But what I do hear about with increasing frequency is people who are anxious about inequality and are anxious about the levels of immigration, and they tie the two issues together at one nexus, which is the housing market, particularly in Auckland, particularly, Mr Speaker, in the Epsom electorate. And Mr Speaker, I'm just interested in why that is and whether these issues really do go together. Is the problem with inequality, the housing market and immigration really a problem caused by excessive immigration, as some would have it? Or is it a problem with a dysfunctional market in housing alone? And one way to ask yourself the question, Mr Speaker, is to ask how some other markets have been impacted by record levels of immigration. Well, we might ask ourselves, what has happened to the market for jobs? Just today, Mr Speaker, at a time of record immigration, the lowest unemployment in 8 years. And it's kind of interesting. People like to claim what is known as the lump of labour fallacy, that there are only so many jobs in a particular place, and if more people come, somebody will be unemployed. And the reality of this is that when people come to a country, when they earn money, when they spend it, they create demand which leads to jobs, or Say's law that demand creates its own supply. But, Mr Speaker, you might ask yourself about the electricity market, another market which is free and flexible in New Zealand. What has happened in the past decade to the price of electricity? Well, it's actually gone down, partly because some generators overbuilt in the middle of the last decade, but we have not seen an increase in the price of electricity because there are too many immigrants. We have not seen an increase in the price of food, cars, electronics or clothes. In fact, all of those things have stayed relatively static. And the Ministry of Social Development tells us, and Statistics New Zealand tell us, that the increase in inequality based on consumption over the last 30 years is practically negligible. So why then, Mr Speaker, why is there so much anxiety about equality, about immigration and housing? And it is simply because the housing market, and the Auckland housing market in particular, is highly dysfunctional. It is extraordinary, Mr Speaker, that New Zealand reached its peak in home building in 1974. And people should just think about that for a moment. 1974, there were more homes built in New Zealand than any year since. And they didn't have nail guns, and they weren't built by the state. A couple of thousand of the 39,000 were built by the state. Something has gone seriously wrong. And if you want to ask what that is, well, it's simply this. The price of available land that people are allowed to build upon has gone through the roof because of dysfunctional regulation of planning and dysfunctional funding of infrastructure. Those are the problems that we need to solve. But it also tells you something else, Mr Speaker, is that there are two worlds in New Zealand when it comes to concern about inequality and poverty. There is the world that works. All of those markets I mentioned, electricity, clothing, transport, food, electronics, all of those markets that are free and open markets exposed to competition from the world, or at least very well regulated within New Zealand, where prices go down and people have plenty. And then there's the market that the government regulates the supply of land, where the government regulates the standards of building, and where the government has almost a monopoly on the way that infrastructure is funded, and the price of housing has gone up. It's the only commodity that has gone up in price in real terms in the last 30 years, and it is the one that is the key contributor to inequality and poverty. So I say to this House, is what I say to people at Epsom, at Auckland, and overseas, and up and down New Zealand, and overseas if I listen, is that we do not have a crisis of immigration. What we have is a crisis in the government regulation of our housing markets. That is what this government and any other government needs to fix. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.